Dan Wingard, office leader, business coach, Redmond John L. Scott, going over, this is page 3 of the Form 21, the residential purchase and sale agreement with the Northwest Multiple Listing Service. We'll just dive right into it. Want to go into detail and also be as quick and concise as possible as we're doing this. So with this, we are looking at, again, page 3, and we talk about title insurance. The seller authorizes buyer's lender or closing agent at seller's expense to apply for the ALTA form of homeowner's policy. So I'm not going to go into all the different kinds of title. I think it's important that you meet with the title rep to discover what those are. But the thing I want to clarify here is the seller is authorizing and they're paying for that portion of the homeowner's title insurance. And another thing is that a lot of the sellers and great real estate brokers will make sure that they've opened preliminary title. They likely have some relationship with a title company, title and escrow company. And so they'll stipulate on the listing who they pulled preliminary title with. So what it says here in the contract, the boilerplate, it says if seller previously received a preliminary commitment from a title company that buyer declines to use, buyer shall pay any cancellation fees owing to the original title insurance company. Now, we don't see title insurance companies typically asking for that to be paid, but that is in the contract to where that's a possibility. So otherwise, the party applying for title insurance shall pay any title cancellation fee in the event such a fee is assessed. All right, if the title, let's see, talks about title insurance shall provide a then current ALTA if the homeowner's portion isn't available, with additional protection if available. And it does say here the title insurance company shall send a copy of their preliminary commitment to these parties. You, as the real estate broker, make sure that you follow through and that is taken care of. You're kind of leading the charge here. So even though it says it in the contract, make sure that's being done either by your transaction coordinator or you're following through and making sure the title company, escrow company, is doing that. Preliminary commitment. This is important here. The preliminary title commitment and title policy to be issued shall contain no exceptions other than general exclusions and exceptions consistent with the condition of title herein provided. And if title cannot be made so insurable prior to closing it, then buyer's sole and exclusive remedy, the earnest money shall, unless buyer elects to waive such defaults or encumbrances, be refunded to the buyer, unless less any unpaid costs described in this agreement. So what we're seeing in our current environment says buyer shall have no right to specific performance or damage as a consequence of seller's inability to provide insurable title. But what we're seeing is that a lot of these earnest monies have been released and turned to a non-refundable fee. And if there's not verbiage in that releasing the money, if for some reason something comes up on title, the seller will still maintain those funds. So be careful of that. Make sure that you're communicating that to the buyer and the risk involved. That's a whole nother story as far as the non-refundable fee. But again, just a little bit about that on title. So closing and possession, this stipulates what, when the closing date is earlier in the agreement, but this just talks about if that date happens to be on Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday, or day when the county recording office is closed, the closing agent shall close the transaction the next day following that. And closing means the date on which all documents are recorded and the sale proceeds are available to seller. So as it says here, seller shall deliver the keys and garage door remotes to buyer on the closing date or on the possession date, whichever occurs first. So in this environment, we're also seeing a lot of post-closing rental agreements, and keys are not being delivered at closing. They're being delivered later. And per contract, the buyer actually has the right to the key and the garage door opener, basically access to the property upon closing. So that's important. And it says here, buyer shall be entitled to possession at 9 p.m. on the possession date. And I like to put in there if the closing and possession, which is ideally on the same date, that instead of possession on closing, maybe put closing or possession upon recording. That way the buyer has access to it as soon as the property is recorded, instead of having to wait till 9 p.m. Okay, here's another important part. Sellers shall either repair or replace any system or appliance, including but not limited to plumbing, heat, electrical, and all included items that become inoperative or malfunction prior to closing, with a system or appliance of at least equal quality. So I encourage listing brokers to put a home warranty in place. So if something does come up, especially if the homeowner has moved out, that anything would be taken care of. But again, the seller is responsible up into closing. Well, what happens if somebody, the seller stays around after closing and something becomes inoperative? It is now the buyer's responsibility, unless something else is stated, because they are now the owners. They're the landlord. So something to pay attention to. Buyer reserves the right to walk through the property within 5 days of closing to verify that seller has maintained the property and system appliances as required by this paragraph. And then it says seller shall not enter into or modify existing leases or rental agreements, service contracts, or other agreements affecting the property, which have terms extended beyond closing without first obtaining buyer's consent, which shall not be unreasonably withheld. Okay, it talks about if possession transfers at a time other than closing. Again, we're seeing a lot of that in our current environment. The party shall execute Form 65A or 65B. It's imperative that that's included, not just allowing the buyer and seller to have that agreement. Just know that if there is possession after closing, it's stating that you will execute this 65A or 65B. So you, as the real estate broker, make sure that you're being the professional and are having that included. And also advise of the need to contact their respective insurance companies to assure appropriate hazard and liability insurance policies are in place as applicable. So pay attention to that. All right, this last paragraph just says that requires the seller of any owner-occupied single-family residence to equip the residence with a carbon monoxide alarm in accordance with the state building code before a buyer or any other person may legally occupy their residence following a sale. That's why we make sure that that's put in before the appraiser is there, because the appraiser takes a look at that. Law also requires the seller of a dwelling unit does not have at least one smoke detection service to provide at least one smoke detection service in the unit before the buyer or any other person occupies the following sale. And the brokers are not responsible for ensuring that the seller complies with that. Buyer and seller shall hold the broker and their firms harmless from any claim resulting from seller's failure to install those. So it kind of removes us of the responsibility, and we're leading the charge. So we want to set the expectations and make sure things are being done that they've agreed to in writing. So 1031 exchange, the whole 1031 exchange process is a whole nother training. And if either buyer or seller intends for this to be a part of it, it basically allows it, says the other party shall cooperate in the completion as long as the cooperating party incurs no additional liability in doing so. That could be time-wise, it could be finances, any of those things. And so long as any expenses, including attorney's fees and costs incurred by the cooperating party that are related only to the exchange, are paid or reimbursed to the cooperating party at or prior to closing. So it's basically saying if either party is utilizing one of these, there should be further documentation, but this is allowing it. Closing costs and proration and charges and assessments. This is stated earlier in the contract as far as who's responsible for what. And that is right here on line 12, either requested or waived. we're past that. That's the charges, assessments levied before but due after closing by buyer. So that's LIDs. That means that, let's see, let's go to this. Where are we? We are on page 3. That is, no, I skipped right past this, and we are talking about, yeah, no, we're here. It goes into the next paragraph, but the LIDs, local improvement districts, seller, it just clarifies here, closing cost, proration charges, seller and buyer shall each pay 1/2 of the escrow fee unless otherwise required by applicable FHA or VA regulations. I encourage all of you listing brokers to make sure that you provide an estimated net proceeds, as well as having the lender provide that to the buyer on what that is, because the lender is going to have the cost, and then make sure that they're following up upon closing and when they're signing to make sure those are in alignment. So it talks about taxes for the current year, rent, interest, and lienable homeowners association dues shall be prorated as of closing. Buyer shall pay loan costs, including credit report, appraisal charge, and lender's title insurance, unless otherwise provided. If any payments are delinquent on encumbrances which will remain after closing, closing agent is instructed to pay such delinquencies at closing from money due or to be paid by seller. Again, buyer and seller are agreeing to this paragraph, and it's your responsibility to understand what they're going through, what they need to look out for, and so you're communicating that. If there's a fuel tank, buyer shall pay for remaining fuel in the fuel tank if, prior to closing, seller obtains a written statement from the supplier as to the quantity and current price and provides such statement to the closing agent. So seller shall pay all utility charges, including unbilled charges, unless waived in specific term number 12. That's the beginning there, what I just went over. Seller and buyer request the service of closing agent in dispersing funds necessary to satisfy unpaid utility charges. And seller shall provide the names and addresses of all utilities providing service to the property and having lien rights. So making sure that they have the 22K filled out properly. And I encourage all sellers to connect with the escrow company. It's a great call to make to the sellers as a listing broker to make sure that they got potentially any money refunded, because the escrow company may be estimating and sending an estimated payment and may be getting funds back. Good connection call after closing. Finally, buyers advised to verify the existence amount of any LID, capacity or impact charges, or other assessment that may be charged against the property before or after closing. So this is like a sewer capacity charge, newer construction. Sometimes these can last 15 years, maybe even 20 years. And it's a monthly fee, but it's a fairly large amount sometimes, $10,000, $20,000. So seller will pay such charge that are or become due on or before closing. So making sure as you're listing this property, if there are LIDs, that you're aware of the amount, the seller's aware of the amount. They're not agreeing to pay something that likely would be an ongoing monthly charge that they could potentially hand off to the buyer. On the other side, on the negotiation for the buyer, that potentially they could have the seller pay this off, so it's not an encumbrance on the buyer to move that forward. All right, so that is page 3. We'll stop there and continue in our next segment. Any questions, feel free to reach out.